If you were hearing the phrase reading between the lines for the first time, you'd probably be pretty confused. No matter how long you look, there's no additional text in that white space. When we read between the lines, we're looking beyond the most literal interpretation of a statement, from other ideas or themes to implications from nonverbal cues. This phrase illustrates a valuable idea when it comes to verbal communication, even if it talks about written words. Some people prize saying exactly what they mean, getting even the most easy to understand context out in the open, with as little as possible left to interpretation. Others make a statement that only implies the emotional truth behind the message, hoping to convey a point with tact so as to avoid embarrassing or upsetting others, or for another purpose. Whether we find ourselves easily reading between the lines, or frustrated by people who don't say what they mean, we're learning the many ways that people imply versus directly state things in their messages today. I'm Cassandra Ryder, and this is Study Hall, Intro to Human Communication. Imagine you walk into a room where the people having a conversation there clearly share a lot of history. As an outsider, you might be able to pick up a few things just from listening to them, but some of their inside jokes and past references are going to go right over your head. Cultures around the world have different levels of this insiderness, or context that most people grow up sharing. Some cultures rely on a lot of shared social structure, well-known traditions within the group, and shared expectations of behavior. Because of all of this past history together, members of these cultures can be less direct, not spelling things out that are assumed, or even just communicating with a look or nonverbal cue. These are called high context cultures. It's easier to have a high context culture if the group of people have very similar traditions and cultural expectations for generations, without a lot of new outsiders entering the culture and shaking things up. Sometimes, these cultures play out as behavioral expectations for a certain gender, age, or a certain relationship. For instance, some languages have different versions of the same word for whether we're showing respect for someone older than us versus a peer. Just knowing the dictionary definition of the word wouldn't be enough. By contrast, low-context cultures are often diverse, bringing together people who all have their own varied and separate subcultures and many forms of behavioral expectations. Without a strict structure that shows how someone ought to behave, people often focus on speaking directly and saying exactly what they mean. Leaving meaning up to implication and interpretation can mean a misunderstanding with someone who shares little context with us. The United States is a strong example of a low-context culture as a whole, even if there are pockets of high-context culture in certain communities. A great example of low-context cultural communication is to look at syllabus documents or job descriptions as forms of communication. Because people have different expectations based on their past experiences, these documents try to be as clear as possible about expectations so that even people with very different backgrounds have a good chance at succeeding. One of the aspects of context that can mean different things depending on our culture, or even on the individual with whom we communicate, is emotional expression. Some cultures use more gestures, outward emotionality, and confrontation, while others are less outright, using very small changes in emotionality to convey nonverbal information that might look like a monotone or a flat expression to someone who isn't familiar with the culture. There are variations everywhere, but sociologists that look at emotional expression in culture identify trends. There are cultures where outright emotionality is common in both verbal and nonverbal communication, including places like Brazil and Mexico. On the other hand, expressing one's emotions is much more rare in cultures like those of Japan and the United Kingdom, where an emotional expression in communication could be more often perceived as immature or unprofessional, even if it would be considered appropriate in Italy or Brazil. There are a wide variety of ways that these levels of emotionality play out, including the low emotionality of places like Germany and Denmark still having lots of disagreement and confrontation as long as it stays calm. These contrast with other low emotionality places like South Korea, where the combination of low confrontation with very few emotional markers creates a context that may be hard to read for outsiders. Even within a family group or a small town, there may be a tendency towards high or low confrontation and high or low emotional expression. Some research shows that if we're paying close attention, many of the super subtle ways that emotion can be conveyed are consistent across cultures. But we have to learn what triggers those micro expressions in a given context. But communicating across cultures is a two-way street, even if one person is the outsider in a big group of insiders. Let's look at how reaching across a difference in emotionality and directness can create positive outcomes. Celia has always enjoyed learning Spanish in her high school and college classes, and she paid close attention when teachers talked about cultural differences between her small hometown in the United States and the various countries where Spanish was commonly spoken. Celia opted to take a teaching job at a school in Colombia after she graduated, And at first, she felt like even her strong language skills weren't working with her coworkers. Finally, she asked a friendly fellow teacher, Anna, if there was something unusual about the way she communicated. In this context, Celia's quiet and calm demeanor had been interpreted as being standoffish, rather than as being a sign that she was very focused on her language skills when communicating. Anna wasn't accustomed to spelling out why she'd felt this way about Celia, since she and the other teachers all came from the high-context Colombian culture and they were accustomed to more emotional expression in coworker interactions. They'd been slower to warm up to Celia because of their interpretation of her behavior. But learning the background of Celia's approach helped Celia and Anna bond. Now, Celia and Anna can both work on their intercultural communication. Celia tries to let more of her emotions show through as a way of building relationships at work, and Anna invites her to spend time outside of work with the other teachers. Anna's willingness to be more direct and Celia's building of her own emotional openness in a new culture allows them to forge a new bond and improve the wider connections between their teaching team. Anna and Celia end up building a relationship because they are able to make note of what is common in their own culture and also see from another cultural perspective. They can then make compromises in how they communicate to be as relationally appropriate as possible. If we have been paying attention in a new cultural context, we're building an understanding of how to let emotions come through, or not, in a way that really gets our point across to a person from a different culture. Getting our points across, however, may be impossible without a really key component: trust. Certainly, trust matters in a very basic way. Does this person think I'm telling them the truth and can be relied upon? But trust is also deeper. Can a person from another culture trust the way that I'm communicating, especially if I'm from outside their high context background? Trust building can be divided into two approaches: the way that trust is built and valued. Cognitive trust is when we've demonstrated a non-emotional track record. In cultures like the United States, Denmark, and the United Kingdom, it's common to build cognitive trust first, especially with new acquaintances and work relationships. We keep our personal life out of it, appealing to people by keeping our word, completing our work, showing up on time, and other task-related methods of establishing trust. Effective trust is more relationship-based, built by establishing connection through interactions and friendships. Many cultures around the world, including places like Nigeria and Saudi Arabia, include more social elements and outings before a major business decision is made. These are an opportunity to use high-context conversations to size each other up and understand the other person's ethics. Relationship-based trust, on the other hand, relies on evaluations that might be seen as more subjective. In either case, if we want to have success in a new culture, we want to both understand how we trust people and how the people in this new culture tend to establish trust. In reality, most people use some combination of affective and cognitive trust when making decisions about who they will work with or become friends with. But depending on their background culture, they may value one over the other. So, we understand our own cultural approaches with regard to directness, emotional expression, and trust. Now we can do our research to compare our method to the general approaches in new cultures where we find ourselves communicating. Of course, this research also includes spending time listening and observing people in their own contexts. Through these approaches, we can modify the way we share our messages to build better connections and improve our intercultural communication. There will be times when people adapt to our way of communicating, but the greatest chance for strong communication happens when both sides of an interaction are doing their best to be effective and appropriate, just like Celia and Anna. Thanks for watching Study Hall, Intro to Human Communication, which is part of the Study Hall project, a partnership between ASU and Crash Course. If you liked this video and want to keep learning with us, be sure to subscribe. You can learn more about Study Hall and the videos produced by Crash Course and ASU in the links in the description. See you next time!